Welcome to How To with NADTC, where we tackle your big challenges in small doses. In this episode, we're going to hear from Emily Braley on how to start a volunteer transportation program. Emily is the manager at NV Rides in Fairfax, Virginia. We're excited to have Emily join our series.
Hi, my name is Emily Braley. I'm the manager of NV Rides, a volunteer rides program in Northern Virginia. And I'm going to talk today about how to start a volunteer transportation program in your community. So I think one thing people want to start with is why start a volunteer transportation program? You probably have the need in your community. Many riders do not qualify for paratransit, but traditional public transit would be challenging for them. And the people most affected by this are older adults and adults living with disabilities. Alternatives to public transportation like taxis and Ubers can be very expensive. And public transportation infrastructure in this country doesn't meet every destination type. It's really hard in rural areas or even ex-urban areas to find public transportation that would get you to where you need to go in a reasonable time or go where you need to go. And then I think the number one reason that people want to bring volunteer transportation to their community is companionship, community building, social isolation prevention, building relationships and trust. It's more than just a ride that we provide in our programs. We also provide community and connection between riders and drivers, which is really important for both sides. So volunteer transportation programs have a number of characteristics that are common amongst them. They're an important support for seniors and people who want to age in place, maybe who have disabilities. They create a vital social connection for seniors and people with disabilities, especially people who maybe are confined to their homes or have challenges getting out of their homes. And then we create communities of mutual care, trust, connection, and they create connection across our community, sometimes intergenerational, sometimes amongst neighbors. So there's a few more characteristics that volunteer transportation programs tend to have. They have formal policies for riders, drivers, what type of services are offered. They have a way of recruiting and training volunteers, usually using software and IT to coordinate rides. And that's because it's really overwhelming if you try and do this on pen and paper or like word of mouth or emails. Typically, there's some software kind of uniting the program. And then there's usually a staff person, either paid or a volunteer, who is like a transportation coordinator who takes the requests, who makes phone calls, returns phone calls. And that person in different organizations has a different title, or maybe even paid or unpaid, but there's usually someone at the hub in the middle coordinating it all. So I'll go over kind of the basic steps that you could undertake to start one of these programs. This is at a high level. Every community is unique. So we'll talk about getting started, volunteer recruitment, how to reach riders, how to train your drivers and other types of volunteers, and then how to evaluate, iterate, and improve your program. So getting started, the first thing you're going to want to think about is who to serve. You could consider an existing community. Sometimes that's a nice springboard for your program. A housing complex, a faith community, an HOA, kind of people who know one another, have that trust in a relationship, and maybe want to add driving to that relationship. Another thing is to consider the geography, maybe bound your geography or your population at first, just so that it's maybe easier to have the rides accepted. Maybe it's a small area you want to start with as a pilot. So consider where you want to allow people to request, where do they live, where's the starting point, where's the end point that you're going to allow. So you also want to think about what types of rides and maybe services you want to offer. So some common ride types that volunteer programs tend to offer are errands, grocery shopping, non-emergency medical transit, religious services, social events, but really anything you can dream or your population wants, you could consider adding. But it's nice to define up front what you're going to do and not do. You also, this is a big one for almost every program, is funding. Usually you need some seed funding. I mentioned software is a cost usually. Phone lines, office space, and computers can be important. You might need staff, even if you're going to be mostly volunteer run. You might need someone to train or recruit volunteers. Background checks are a cost for most programs. Some programs have the volunteers donate the cost of their background check, but sometimes it's nice to fund those because you can get maybe volunteers who don't want to pay to volunteer, but who are happy to join you. Training and supporting volunteers takes time. You need staff or other volunteers to work on that. And then your program will need insurance. I also like to say make a budget that accounts for some growth, because hopefully year over year, your background check costs increase because you're recruiting more volunteers, you're doing more volunteer trainings. So hopefully you have a little bit of growth as your program gets started. And those costs do increase the bigger your program gets, particularly the background checks and the training. So some common funding sources I've heard of would be local governments, nonprofits focused on older adults and adults with disabilities, faith groups. Public transit tends to be involved in a lot of communities. Older Americans Act Title III-B funding, and then FTA Section 5310, the enhanced mobility funding tends to be a good fit for this type of program. You can also think about your target population, and that can help you think about what funding source you might want to pursue. So program planning, volunteer management software is going to be one of the first things you want to pick out. There's lots of options. So you can always comparison shop, ask for demos. There's a lot of programs out there. The ideal program would be able to manage your rides, your riders, your drivers, and your coordinators in one package. And then another feature I think you want to look for is a way to automatically determine a driver's license and car insurance expiry, and maybe automatically email the drivers or notify a coordinator, because as your program grows, it gets really unwieldy to manage everybody's expirations of their driver's license and their car insurance, especially because it can be every 6 months with car insurance. So you're going to want to have a software that in some way automates that management for you. And you can comparison shop. There's lots of programs out there. Then also translating your program, the things that you want to do, the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, into policies. You want clear policies that you can communicate to the community, you can communicate to the riders and the drivers, and that maybe you would have rider and driver agreements so that everybody knows what they're responsible for and not responsible for. And it also helps to, when you're talking to stakeholders, to talk about what you do and what policies you have. Talking a little bit about insurance, because this is something as you start your program, you'll need to find, and it's a cost. So you do need insurance to protect drivers and the organization beyond what just normal car insurance policies offer. So the volunteers will all need their own car insurance that meets state standards, just like they would to drive a vehicle if they weren't volunteering. But then on top of that, your organization will need some umbrella policy. And that will cover things that are not related to the vehicle or driving, or cover maybe excess liability related to the driving. Things like a client fall or a medical issue, you would need umbrella insurance for that. So you can either, you may be a nonprofit and you're going to, maybe get underwritten for an add-on to your normal umbrella policy, or you may be a new organization, in which case you may want to think about a standalone product. VIS and SEMA are two companies I've seen and worked with before that do provide volunteer insurance and volunteer driver insurance. And then, like I mentioned, all the drivers will need insurance that meets state minimums no matter what, but you're going to want to ensure your program has insurance as well. So recruiting volunteers, they're the backbone of your programs. The very first thing you're going to do when you get started, develop a communications plan, a recruitment strategy. And so the very first thing you're going to do is recruit volunteers before you have riders. Once you have a core group of founding, enthusiastic volunteer drivers, you can go out and do outreach to your riders. So you always need to recruit volunteers on an ongoing basis, because hopefully you're growing, you're getting more clients, you need more volunteers. And then there's also, natural attrition that occurs. So you're going to always be recruiting volunteers, but the first step is to get those volunteers in. So speaking of different volunteer types, you might need to recruit, thinking about, you'll need to recruit volunteer drivers. They're the backbone of your program. But equally as important would be phone answering or coordinating volunteers. They're going to be the ones who take the calls. They're going to maintain your database. They're going to be the ones who coordinate the rides. They're kind of brokering the experience for everyone. And they can sometimes, once they're trained, do that from home. They can do it remotely. They don't need to be able to drive. It's a great thing for people who don't drive, who really want to volunteer and contribute. Sometimes clients can even do it. Everyone can help. And these volunteers are really important because they make sure that everybody has a good experience and that everything happens on time and everybody's rides are covered. And then some programs use volunteers as volunteer recruiters. So maybe some volunteers go to farmers markets or events and just recruit other volunteers and talk about your program and do some outreach. So everyone can help. Think broadly. Even if someone doesn't drive and they're interested in helping, you can help recruit them into your program. So some things that work for volunteer recruitment, we've noticed our farmers markets are great. The weather's nice. Social media, Facebook pages, especially local pages, next door, expos and public events, print ads, PSAs on public access TV or radio. And then we've used the Every Ride Counts volunteer driver campaign, which has like pre-made kind of PR materials that you can use to communicate about your program. And then just when you're thinking about where to recruit volunteers, look in the areas you serve, keep it really local. If you're trying to drive in a certain town, maybe start with that town's events, because that's where you're really going to want to find people. So other things about volunteer recruitment, staff or volunteers who coordinate rides are really important to protect your driver's time. They don't, you don't want the driver to be taking the requests because they're trying to focus on driving and serving the client. So you do need someone to answer the phone, manage incoming requests, communicate with volunteers, receive inquiries from new clients, respond to everybody's concerns and questions. There's going to be things that come up. There's going to be weather. There's going to be new requests. There's going to be changes to appointments. And you need someone to help answer the phone. And they can absolutely be volunteers. You just need someone to do that. So rider outreach is the next step. After you have your core group of enthusiastic, brand new volunteers, you're going to recruit riders. We know there's typically really high demand for these programs. So just think about it, you're going to get a lot of requests, and think about maybe reaching out to underserved members of your community who may benefit, but maybe are not aware of this program. So some places we know that riders hear about us are doctors' offices, area agencies on aging, AAAs, senior centers, community centers. Some faith communities have like senior interest groups or senior groups. They'll talk about our program. Word of mouth is great. Senior living expos. And then as you're thinking about who your target riders are, in most programs, the riders are people who live in their own home. They are people who live in a townhouse, apartment, single family home, condo. They no longer drive, but they're independent in that they're living, by themselves, or maybe with family members. And word of mouth is good outreach. So encourage it. It's great. People can bring a buddy. You can grow your community that way. So next step is going to be to training your drivers and your volunteers. And before you onboard a new volunteer, I recommend a checklist. You're going to verify their license is in date and valid. You're going to do a background check for all your volunteers. You're going to verify that the driver is maintaining active insurance that meets state standards. They can send you the policies with the expiration date. And then a lot of programs conduct reference checks or interviews just to validate someone's identity. Go through this checklist. Once someone's set to jet, you've gone through your process. You're going to train your drivers and your volunteers. So consider regular intervals for onboarding new volunteers. I know some groups do monthly, quarterly, weekly. How many volunteers you have will dictate your pace, but it's nice to have these group sessions. It's really good to create a community this way, because sometimes this opportunity feels like freelance. You're out, you're in the community, you're in someone's car. This opportunity to train as a group gives people a chance to meet one another, create a community, find out what they're doing, answer questions with one another. You're always going to review how to use your software. Super important right off the bat. Teach them how to use whatever software you're going to be using. Go over the policies you have, answer any questions, and then really create that time for socialization and connection. Also, we recommend driver and rider agreements. That way they can reference something that's super clear about what they agreed to and didn't agree to on both sides. So we always recommend evaluating and iterating, improving on your program. Our program does an annual survey. I know programs that have more riders may even do it more frequently. We survey riders and drivers, and we look for gaps in service, experience, areas we want to grow and improve. We look at equity and community needs. What are people asking for? What are we offering? What should we offer? How can we improve? How can we make our service meet the needs of our community better? And every year we make an action plan based on our survey results. And so that's one way for us to learn from our riders and our drivers and make the program better for everyone. So the last thing is I love to share these programs. It's one of the reasons I'm doing this today. I want to meet you. We should meet one another. There's so many things we can learn from one another's program. We don't always have to learn the hard way by doing it ourselves. Sometimes what another volunteer rides program is doing is something you can do and you can adopt for yourself or learn from them, learn from their experiences, their pitfalls, their successes. Their survey results can sometimes inform your survey results. So share with one another. I think having a big nationwide community like this helps us to create better programs without reinventing the wheel all the time. So thank you so much for your attention today. And I'm excited for you to consider joining our community of volunteer rides programs.
Thank you for watching this episode of How To with NADTC on how to start a volunteer transportation program. We hope you found this information valuable and insightful. Please be sure to check out other episodes in this series for other helpful tips.